Hi everyone, my name is Emily Drabinski, and I am the Critical Pedagogy Librarian and Interim Chief Librarian at the Graduate Center at the City University of New York. I am so excited to be joining you in Manchester for Lilac this spring. I can't wait to see you in a few weeks. In advance of that, I'll be sharing this short presentation that we will discuss at the event called Structure and Power, Information Literacy for Liberation. I'm speaking to you from my home in Brooklyn, New York, and we just want to, before I start, say a huge thank you to Heather Lincoln for all of her work in organizing this conversation for me to have with all of you. It's been 2 years since I had to cancel my flight to Manchester in the wake of COVID-19, and I thought there was no chance I would ever get a chance to see all of you in the UK again. And I'm just so thrilled and so hopeful that we'll be able to gather together again to share ideas, thoughts, conversation, laughter, all of those things that we've missed over the past 2 years. And I'm so looking forward to having a conversation about power. I think that this is the most important conversation any of us could be having in libraries right now, and I'm excited to have it with all of you. So what are we going to talk about today? I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about libraries as structures that produce power inside of institutions, and that power is sort of shared and negotiated and spread around and organized and wielded by individuals, by groups within our institutions. Those can be institutions of higher education, where most of us at this conference probably work, uh, government libraries, public libraries, and sort of the ways that that our institutions sit inside of bigger ones, other ones, and are sort of spaces where we accrue power, where power sediments, and where power is sort of wielded and used to different ends inside of our institutions. And for me, whenever I'm talking about power, I'm talking about structures. So I think sometimes we have a fantasy that power is about the boss telling you what to do, right? That the the power of sort of a parent, right? Where I tell my 13-year-old to play trombone and he resists by refusing to practice, something that I'll be dealing with as soon as I'm done with this recording. But I like to think instead of sort of reducing power to those one-on-one or individual interactions, how can we understand power as accreting inside of our institutions and inside of our structures? So in the talk that I shared for the Lilac Festival last year, I talked a bit about cataloging and classification systems as a kind of a structuring machine inside of our libraries. And we'll talk a little bit more about that today. But there are all kinds of ordering structures and power structures within libraries, from our cataloging and classification systems to the rules and regulations that we put out to sort of guide behavior in our spaces, to the sort of physical structures, how our shelves are organized, where the bathroom is, where the reference desk is. These are all structures, and as individuals come in and interact with those structures, power is at play. So let's make it concrete. What are some structures of power that we build and maintain and make decisions about inside of our libraries? The first one I think about is sort of rules and regulations that guide how the space is used. So for many of us during COVID times, we had rules who can come in and who can't come into the library. We have regulations about what you can do in different spaces. We have quiet areas. We have areas where food and drink are not allowed. We have areas where you can work as groups, right? All of those rules and regulations that we come up with as maintainers of physical spaces are structures where we are wielding power, right? There's nothing benign or natural or normal about sort of putting a rule at the front of our door at CUNY that you have to have a certain ID card with a certain sticker on it in order to be able to come in. That's exercising power on behalf of the library to maintain sort of rules about who can come into this space. So lots and lots of rules and regulations around noise, timing and schedules, all of those kinds of things. Rules and regulations are an example of sort of a structure of power. And the second is sort of that I think about is the physical plant. One of the things that I really love about libraries is that everything's really material, right? So we've got we've got our cataloging and classification schemes, and these are analytic and abstract and systems that we sort of use to describe and make accessible materials. But we also take that system and we use it to put shelves up, right? So where do books sit next to each other? And how can you find different parts of a sort of books on a given topic? And you have the ways that we have to move through the space to find those things. And rules about sort of where people can sit and those kinds of things are a way that the physical space of a library can be thought of as a structure of power. And then what I'd like to talk most about today is our information retrieval systems. And this is what those of us who are information literacy librarians, this is what we do. This is our bread and butter. We teach people how to find information and then use it and evaluate it and all of those elements of the information literacy work that we do. But the structures that undergird that information retrieval are structures of power. What are the systems against which we ask questions? What is the pool of information that provides those answers? What kinds of language do we use? Do we input in the system to retrieve materials? Who decides what those words are? Who decides when they change? Right? So all of those pieces are part of a structure of power, part of the structuring work that libraries do. So as you're watching this, I'd like you to think about examples of structural power in your library. And I hope that we can spend some time talking about what those structures are when I see you in April. And I think also not only of what we teach students, right, how to come into the library, what the behavioral norms are, what the rules are for retrieving information, but what kinds of structures of power organize your life as a library worker. Think about your relationship to the faculty that you work with. Think about your relationship to your boss. Think about your relationship to your fellow colleagues who are doing information literacy instruction at your institution. What kinds of structures sort of govern the relationships that you have? So it's always like a puzzle for me to talk about these things now because I want to talk both about what we teach and how we teach about libraries. But I'm always cognizant that we're library workers too, that we are caught inside of structures of power, that the structuring machines of our libraries determine something about what we can and can't do in the classroom, from the sort of curriculum models that we come up with that sort of govern what we do, but also the relationships that we have to entities outside of our library that determine and shape so much about what we can teach in the classroom. So I think once we start to understand the library through the lens of power, through an analysis of power and an analysis of structures as productive of power and as ways that power circulates and doesn't in institutions, it changes the way we look at problems that we might solve. So, I've spent a lot of my career thinking about whether we should put the reference desk over here or over there, if we should put the stapler over here or over there, right? Those are the sort of decisions that all of us are making every day, thinking about, should I do an active learning exercise or lecture in this class? Those decisions that we often frame as right or wrong, if we think about them instead as questions of power, of what do the decisions I make right now mean in terms of how power is going to accumulate, how it's going to be distributed in a classroom or in the library, it sort of changes the way that we make decisions. So I, for one, have found that quite liberating, that I'm released from the need to be correct. And instead, I get to think about, what decision do I make? What does it produce for my institution, for my students? How does it distribute power more equitably within my organization, within the library shelves, within the classroom, such that all of us get to enact some power and feel that we are sort of have some control over what we do in our lives, in our research, in our classrooms, and in the library. So in terms of information literacy work, which is the theme of the conference and where I've spent the vast majority of my career, how do we teach about power in the classroom? And part of why I think we need to do that is in the title of this talk, that when we teach explicitly about power and we allow students and facilitate students to sort of understand and recognize the power that they have to make an impact or a change on their themselves, on their institutions, and on the world, there's something liberatory. There's a liberatory potential in the classroom. And I think for information literacy instructors, because we work with such explicit systems of power, it can be easier than it would be in other kinds of classroom scenarios to teach people how power works and how structural power works. Because we're not teaching that sort of abstractly the way that I've tried to do in the last 10 minutes, but instead we're teaching, how do I find an article? And what about that is hard? And how can I understand the difficulties and challenges of that as problems of power? And if I want things to be easier for people like me, how might I change the system to make it so, right? So this is the sort of question that I bring to my information literacy classes. And I think that can be a lens that allows students to both understand how power is constraining their choices, but also how they can access it for themselves. What power do you have, and how can you use it to make a sort of a better world? So I'm going to talk about this in two different ways. First, how do we teach about information retrieval? What in the ways that we talk about that with students can lead them to have a different sense of how power works for themselves and for institutions? And then second, how do we use information, right? This other information literacy problem. So that I've gathered a bunch of stuff, what do I do with it? And both are sort of arenas in the information literacy classroom where I think we're ripe and well positioned to introduce students to ideas about power and change. So how do we teach information retrieval in ways that introduce them to concepts of power? So here is a screenshot. I figured out how to make a screenshot for this presentation. Here's a screenshot of a database search interface that I use in my library all the time. I'm going to teach students how to find 5 evidence-based research articles about wound care for their PICO research paper that's due at the end of the semester for their Nursing 101 class, right? No matter what kinds of big, abstract, conceptual ideas I think we bring to our information literacy classrooms, most of the time, one of the learning outcomes is that students will be able to retrieve the information they need to meet their larger goals. So when I'm teaching this, I'm teaching a structure of power, right? This database is sort of a space where we can see many power relations sort of accreting, right? So sort of consolidating inside of a system that we're asking students to use and that we're using ourselves. So the questions that I ask of this database and that I encourage students to ask in the classroom: who made this? What were the labor conditions of the people who put this database together? What's inside of it? What kinds of information is in the pool, right? And what is excluded? So whose voices count by EBSCO, by the library that licensed it? Who decided the voices that would be inside the database that would be important enough for us to include? What language do we use to retrieve information from this system? Who decides what those controlled vocabulary terms are? Who made them? Who didn't? Are they language that you use when you are talking about a topic? And if not, why do you think you might be excluded? And why do you think your language isn't the sort of language that's used to control the vocabulary inside of this system? How did the database get to the library? Did we make it? Did we buy it? And then how much does it cost? And where does the money come from? And because most of us are working with privatized, corporatized information vendors like EBSCO and ProQuest and a narrowing field, who keeps the profit that's generated from this? Why is a profit necessary? Are there any alternatives that we can imagine? Could we be using a different kind of public database interface? What would that look like? How would we get it? Right? So these are all questions of power. And so, I think in the classroom, and I hope that we can talk about this in the Q&A, how do I talk about the database such that students can get a sense of how power is operating to determine and shape sort of how we how we retrieve information and what we retrieve at the end of the day? How do we teach students this sort of to be critical of how that system came to be while also meeting their curricular needs? And that's the sort of line I'm trying to balance every time I'm in the classroom. Because I definitely want you to get the articles you need. I definitely want you to pass your class. And I definitely want you to know that if you had difficulty using this system, there's a reason. And that reason is one of power. The system is made by some for a particular use, for particular kinds of students, and for a lot of us, we're excluded from that. And why? So when we're teaching students about information retrieval, whether it's a database interface or we're showing them how to use the library catalog to find a book, we're always teaching them about structures of power, right? So here you see the classification schedule for DS, which is world history, and the way that an American classification system organizes information about one of its colonial holdings. You see very explicitly that from the perspective of a US knowledge organizer, the Philippines is about ethnography, a description of people and what they're really like from the perspective of someone who is an other, who has the power to look. That there is the history of the Philippines, how Americans, how Europeans, how those of us in the West, the dominant forces, describe the history of the Philippines. And then there's local history and description, how the Filipino people write about themselves. So it's an imperial power structure. And when we understand it like that, how are we going to teach people how to use it? That's the fundamental question that I bring to my information literacy classes. So if in our information literacy sessions, we're teaching students how to navigate structures of power, how to negotiate systems that are in many cases built intentionally to exclude them, how do we teach them how to use information? That sort of second, bigger, broader piece of the information literacy classroom. So in the first case, we're talking explicitly about tools and tool use. And I think that the ways that we can talk about power in those contexts are fairly clear. And it's one of the real advantages we have as information literacy instructors, right? That we're able to teach students how power works by giving them access to it rather than having to speak about it in abstract ways. When we move to talking to students about synthesis of information, about producing information themselves, about the ways that they as knowledge producers can contribute to these systems, we're also teaching about power. So this is sort of how I think about that second piece. Once I've introduced you to this system, how are you going to change it as a student? If you had a difficult time finding an article, it isn't because there's something wrong with you. It's because the system is built to be difficult, to make it easy for some of us, right? So I come from a dominant subject position. I'm a white American. When I sit down at a computer and type in some keywords, those keywords tend to match what's in the database. The language is built for someone like me. And when I use the information that I find, I'm also pretty comfortable with the language that's available to me. And it seems sort of natural for me to write in ways that reproduce those systems, right? So if you search the database for an article by Emily Drabinski, you'll find it because I'm able to get my material published because I am coming from a dominant position. And so when we're teaching students about their own role as knowledge creators, thinking critically about how they can, what access they do and don't have to publishing systems, to other structures of power inside of libraries and outside of libraries is important too. So how does a student sort of see a future where the work that they would produce would be accommodated by these systems and circulated through them? Is sort of a second question that I ask in the information literacy classroom. So from an information literacy perspective, I'm always interested in teaching students how to negotiate these structures of power. It's very hard to find 5 evidence-based research articles unless you consent to use one of the systems that are available to you. And those systems, by and large, represent dominant perspectives, dominant ideological views of the world. So that's the sort of urgent sort of short-term solution for me in the library classroom is I want to make sure that you understand that the problem is not with you, the problem is with the structure and whose research it enables and whose it doesn't. But I also want those structures to be different. Amanda Bellantara and I are working on a project right now. She's a librarian at NYU and is here at Lilac with me. We're working on a project where we are recording oral histories of those who have put together alternative knowledge organization schemes on behalf of communities traditionally excluded from systems, from dominant systems of knowledge organization. So for examples might include the Waywa Library at the University of British Columbia, which uses a revised version of or uses an implementation of the Brian Deere system to organize materials according to indigenous ways of knowing. The Chicano thesaurus, which uses terms that better reflect Chicano ways of understanding, Chicano knowledge formations, so that the materials are accessible to Chicano users and Chicano researchers. So changing the system also has to be part of our liberatory project. So if we want to transform library structures, how do we do that? And this is where, if you've been following my career over the last few years, I've shifted from thinking only in terms of the library classroom to thinking instead of the ways that we organize collectively on behalf of workers to transform the library workplace. And I think that there are lessons to be learned from that we can bring to the information literacy work that we do. So if I want the structure of power to be different, if I want it to reflect my perspective, how do I get there, right? And so in the last couple of minutes of this talk, I just want to share a few thoughts around that, and I would love to spend some of our Q&A together strategizing and planning. If we want the world to be different, how are we going to do that? From my own work, these are the things that I see as most crucial. First, we have to talk to each other, and I miss talking to people. So I'm so looking forward to the Q&A where we can do some of that. We've got to have what are called organizing conversations, where we figure out what changes do we think are necessary for liberation? What can we agree are the things that we need to see that are different in the world? And then we have to shape our demands. I think a lot of us spend a lot of time complaining, right? And feeling like there's nowhere for our complaints to go. There's no possibility of a future that looks different from the one that we have. So I think crucial to this is shaping our complaints into demands. What are the things that we want to see that are going to be different? And can we sort of concretize those and make them explicit to ourselves so that we can begin to work on behalf of a better world? And then finally, we have to locate our targets. Sometimes that's the boss. Sometimes it's the makers of the Library of Congress classification scheme. Sometimes it's our governor or our governments, something, right? But who are the targets? Who do we have to push to make a change necessary? And what is our plan to get there? So is this work that I would do in an information literacy classroom? Maybe not, although I can imagine some very compelling classroom strategies where we sat down, talked about the problems that we see in the catalog, and came up with better solutions. But it's definitely something that I keep in mind, that when I'm talking to students about the problems they're facing and making it explicit to them that it is about the systems that they're being asked to struggle with, we need to have an answer for those students when they ask, well, what next? What do I do about that? And so this is a sort of different kind of pedagogical project that I think we have to take on for ourselves. We have to understand for ourselves how we can produce a better future for ourselves, for our students, for our library users, and what are the steps that we need to do that. So these are the skills I see as necessary to that liberatory project. And they're skills that we need to have as instructors, that we need to have as library workers if we want to transform the systems that our students use so that they better reflect their realities. The first thing we need to know how to do is how to have organizing conversations. Conversations where we are talking to one another in ways that pull out what our shared concerns are, that inspire and push us towards better classrooms, libraries, and worlds. And I don't mean this in a nostalgic sense, but I mean it if we think back to the beginning of this talk, how do we change our structures so that they are more accessible, that they are more inclusive, so that more of us feel like we have a stake in the future. The second thing we need to do, and this is something librarians do all the time, we need to be able to make lists. We need to understand the extent of our power. We need to have numbers, and this is something that we can talk more about, but the role of lists in consolidating power inside of our libraries and out. And then finally, we need to build the skills of planning campaigns. How do we go from where we are right now, working with information systems and structures that bind us in ways that limit our potential? How do we move towards a future where our information retrieval systems better reflect who we are, that make new kinds of knowledge and knowledge about liberation more available for all of us? So these are the skills that I see as necessary. They are all about power. And That is the thing that I think that's the only conversation that I think we need to be having right now. What is power? How and where is it accumulating inside of our institutions, inside of our libraries? And what are our plans for breaking it up and distributing it more equally so that all of us have an equal opportunity to make new knowledge in the world? So that's the argument. That's the case I'm going to make for organizing as a way of thinking about the library classroom. And I can't wait to talk about this with all of you in Manchester in a few weeks. See you soon.